Good afternoon. There's a story about intellectual life that I was told when I was a student. And that story was that intellectual life, intellectual work, doesn't have a beginning or an end. That I have to think of it more like a party. It's a party that when you enter it, the conversation has already begun, and that when you leave, the conversation continues. I have always had this story about intellectual life haunt me, inspire me, and as we just experienced Essence of Touch of Red, a powerful example of what that looks and feels, sounds like in the realm of dance, and also we are about to be treated to an excerpt from an adaptation of a dialogue between James Baldwin and Audre Lorde that will give us another glimpse into this ongoing conversation. How do we jump into the middle of things and still find a way to advance the dialogue? How do we learn to listen? My name is Tavia Nyong'o. I'm the curator of the public program here at the Park Avenue Armory, and I'm also a professor at Yale. And I want to begin by acknowledging our gathering today is here on Lenape-Hoking, and also we are in the time of the year of Baldwin. It seems to have been the year of Baldwin for a couple years now, and perhaps well into the future, we may always be in the year of Baldwin. We're also around the corner from Hunter College, part of the CUNY system, where Audre Lorde taught. And I do want to give a plug to an upcoming program that we'll have here in the fall in partnership with the City University and the Association for the Study of the Arts of the Present. We'll host one day of their symposium on Not a Luxury, which was inspired by Lorde's admonition that poetry is not a luxury. So please look for Canto de Todes in upcoming Armory program. But now for today's event. When Claudia and I, when Claudia accepted the invitation to conceive this event 2 years ago, we had no way, of course, of anticipating the multiple crises that we face in the world today. But the point was not to anticipate, rather thinking with Walter Benjamin's quote on the tradition of the oppressed. Benjamin says in his theses on the philosophy of history that the state of emergency is in fact endemic. It's in fact quotidian. It's in fact, as another speaker today has shown us, ordinary. So what is the antidote to crisis thinking? Again, I turn to the Caribbean polymath Sylvia Wynter, who says that we must learn to sit down together and talk a little about culture. Sit down and learn to talk a little bit about culture. So simple and so challenging. Why are we afraid to do something as simple as that, right? To move the location of culture, to quote another speaker today, from where it has traditionally stood, been thought to reside, to where it has always, in truth, been grounded, right, amongst the people. James Baldwin and Audre Lorde talk about language in the dialogue that we've circulated. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I invite you to do so. As writers, they revere language, and they abhor its degradation into cant. My aim in the public program has been to get to the needful thing that needs to be said after we've exhausted our scripts. Shamel Pitts and Tushrik Fredericks just demonstrated how much can be communicated without words. They also used words, but how can we model that power, that openness, and that vulnerability to each other against interpretations of the encounter with Baldwin and Lorde that saw one as winning or losing? I have always been inspired by the way they radically accepted each other's presence in order to model a possibility for change. So today's gathering has no concluding roundtable because there can be no conclusion. Instead, we will have plenty of breaks and a closing reception in which you will have an opportunity to talk amongst each other and with our participants who have kindly taken time out of their extraordinarily busy schedules to be with us this afternoon. With that, let me welcome Claudia Rankine, the author of 5 books of poetry and most recently the essay collection, Just Us, An American Conversation. Claudia Rankine is also a playwright and an artist. She co-founded the Racial Imaginary Institute and has won numerous honors, including the Guggenheim, the MacArthur, and the National Endowment of the Arts. A former chancellor of the American Academy of Poets and a current member of NYU's writing program, Claudia is one of those unacknowledged legislators that Percy Bysshe Shelley told you about. So honored to welcome her to the stage to introduce the rest of today's program. Please join me in welcoming Claudia Rankine.
Okay, I wanted to say that, okay. So good afternoon. Welcome to Antagonisms, a gathering. I would like to thank the extraordinarily generous with his knowledge, his ability to think alongside, and the very chill Tavia for inviting me into this generative collaboration and also into the world of the Armory, where apparently all things are possible. So it actually, anything I can do, they can do better, which is great. Rebecca Robinson, your leadership, has gathered us here, and so I thank you. I don't know where you are, if you're here, but thank you. And I thank the entire Armory team for their incredible hospitality, professionalism, and graciousness, especially Darian Shrugs, who must have an invisible twin. I don't know how he does all that he does. I doubt he's even in this room because he's probably handling something. But all our efforts would be for naught if it weren't for our generous participants. I'm not going to name them all except maybe Shamel and Tishik because they have already danced. But without you, we would not be able to be in conversation today. And I know how busy each and every one of you are. And so I am honored and full of gratitude that you are here, all of you. I'm also grateful to everyone who came out on this Saturday. I hope you realize this is the best time to be in New York. So you have left the best time outdoors to come to the best time indoors. How do we live the lives that we are fighting so hard to develop or to keep? How do we live them? Asked Audre Lorde. She goes on to say, the power of that vision is what we are losing. How to respond, how to say what we live now. The 21st century human finds himself also in dread of the not knowing, what to do, and how best to respond. Our global responses and examples vary from genocidal violence in Gaza, Far, Sudan, Ukraine, Nigeria, to name a few of the current on the genocide watch list, to vicious personal attacks, as is modeled by our political and social spheres, to varying responses to how we should be positioning ourselves. Literally, should we sign? Should we march? Should we sit? Should we stand up? Should we sit down? The questions remain daily regarding how or what movements we should be engaging. Because our physical being is what is most impacted by our inability to be in discourse, to hear each other, to listen, to remain in the struggle of communication and connection. I am so honored to have been able to begin our day with my longtime collaborator, His Excellence Shamel Pitts, and the incredible Sharik Federic's Tribe. Their dance troupe is called Tribe. I hope you will follow them wherever you see them. The work is beyond amazing. In 1984, James Baldwin said, "No society can smash the social contract and be exempt from the consequences." And the consequences are chaos for everybody in the society. The chaos that Baldwin refers to sparked my interest in the exerted dialogue you will hear shortly between the writers Lorde and Baldwin. Their intense conversation struggles with the question of where to find power in powerlessness, and hope within a state of being that feels and looks a lot like hopelessness. The struggle is one that seems to be defining the Biden-Trump era, where neither figure is able to offer a viable alternative. Here is a little context for the conversation between the two icons. Lorde and Baldwin met for the first time on December 1st, 1983, for dinner. It was reported they ate very little. Their public conversation began on December 2nd, 1983, on the campus of Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts. Baldwin held a visiting professorship at the college, and Audre Lorde was at the time a professor at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in the city of New York. Essence magazine published an edited section of their conversation, which you can find online. The invisible field of references that inform the conversation are the October 1983 US invasion of Grenada, where Lorde's parents grew up. Britain's anti-apartheid movement is on American college campus, where the call for sanctions is echoed by students who were not arrested. Exactly. The Moynihan Report from 1965 is still informing a crippling narrative of the African American family. Lorde has co-founded the 1980 Kitchen Table Press. And finally, the participants have both been diagnosed with cancer. Audre Lorde began what is known as the Berlin years in 1984, so a year later, and was there until 1992, right after the conversation, and Baldwin would pass away in 1987, so 3 years later. In the here and now, we will hear a short 10-minute excerpt of the Lorde-Baldwin conversation, which occurred in two separate sections. Lorde's plea for intersectionality will come up against Baldwin's laser focus on the destructive power of white supremacy. Our performers, the phenomenal poet and performer LaTasha N and the phenomenal actor Russell Banks, will be doing the reading. Following that, there will be a discussion between the writer, independent scholar, and activist Alexis Pauline Gumbs, whose new biography, Survival is a Promise, The Eternal Life of Audre Lorde, will be available in August. And there are yes. And there are cards that you can have as a reminder to order the book. And my colleague at NYU, Professor Robert Reid-Pharr, his highly anticipated biography of James Baldwin, The Making of an American Icon, will eventually be in your hands. So please join me in welcoming LaTasha Nevada Diggs and Russell Banks.
It's on.
It is vital for me to be able to listen to you, to hear what it is that defines you, and for you to listen to me and hear what is it that defines me. Because so long as we are operating in that old pattern, it doesn't serve anybody, and it certainly hasn't served us.
I know that, but what I really think is that neither of us have anything to prove, and we wouldn't have anything to prove at all, at least not in the same way, if we weren't in the North American wilderness and the inevitable dissensions between brother and sister, man and woman. Let's face it, all these relations, which are rooted in love, also are involved in this quarrel. Because our real responsibility is to endlessly redefine each other. And I cannot live without you. You cannot live without me, and the children cannot live without us.
We have to define ourselves for each other. Because no matter what the underpinnings of the distortions are, the fact remains that we have absorbed them. Mm-hmm. We have all absorbed this sickness and disease in the same way we have absorbed racism, in the same way we deal constantly with racism, recognizing this as a legitimate area of injury. Mm-hmm. We must also examine the ways we have absorbed sexism, heterosexism. These are norms in this dragon we have been born into, and we need to examine these distortions with the same kind of openness and dedication that we examine racism.
You use the word racism.
Oppression based on color.
But beneath the word racism sleeps the word safety. Why is it important to be white or black?
Why is it important to be a man or a woman?
So in both cases, it is assumed that it's safer to be white than to be black. It is assumed that it's safer to be a man than to be a woman. These are both masculine assumptions, but these are the assumptions that we're trying to overcome, to confront.
To confront. Yeah. The vulnerability that lives behind those masculine assumptions is something that we must begin to look at and begin to understand.
Yes, yes.
And the fury that is engendered in the denial of that vulnerability is also something you can begin to look at.
Yeah, but we're not talking now about men and women. We're talking about a particular society. We're talking about a particular time and place.
From there, we can raise different assumptions. I have to break through it with you. We have to break through it because there are children growing up believing that it is legitimate to shed female blood, right?
Well, you were talking about the shedding of black female blood in the streets, but I don't understand.
Okay. The cops are killing the men, and men are killing women. I'm talking about rape. I'm talking about murder.
I'm not disagreeing with you, but I do think you're barking up the wrong tree. I'm not trying to get the black man off of the black woman, for that matter, but what I'm talking about is the kingdom in which we live.
Yes, I absolutely agree. The kingdom in which these distortions occur has to be changed.
Yeah, something happens to the man who beats up a lady. Something happens to a man who beats up his grandmother. Something happens to the junkie. I know that very well. I walk the streets of Harlem. I grew up there, right? Now, you've got to know that it's not the black cat's fault who sees me and tries to mug me. I got to know that. It's his responsibility, but it's not his fault. That's the nuance. I got to know that it's not him who is my enemy. Even when he beats up his grandmother has got to know. What I'm trying to say, one has got to see what drove both of us into the streets. Do you see what I mean? I've come home myself, wanting to beat up anything in sight. But Audre,
I'm here.
No, I'm agreeing with you.
I'm here.
I see exactly what you mean, and it hurts me at least as much as it hurts you. But how not to lose him or her who may be in what is, in effect, occupied territory? That is the reality with the black situation in this country.
Jimmy, we don't have an argument.
For the ghetto, all that's lacking is barbed wire. And when you pen people up like animals, the intention is to debase them, and you have debased them.
We don't have.
I know.
We don't.
I know. We don't. Yes.
But we do have a real disagreement about your responsibilities, not just to me, but to that young man, to my son, and to our boys.
Okay.
Your responsibility to him is to get across to him in a way that I will never be able to, because he came out of my body and has another relationship with me. Mm-hmm. Your relationship to him as his father is to tell him, I'm not a fit target for his fury.
Okay.
It's so entrenched in him that it's as much part of him as his blackness is.
All right. All right.
I can't do it. You have to.
All right. I accept it. The challenge is there in any case. It never occurred to me that it would be otherwise. That's absolutely true. But I simply want to locate where the danger is.
Yeah, we're at war.
We are behind the gates of a kingdom which is determined to destroy us.
Yes, exactly. So I'm interested in rejecting any terms that will help us destroy each other.
Part of the horror of being a black American is being trapped into being an imitation of an imitation.
That's right. There's nobody who fulfills that.
Yeah, but you know what I mean. I'm not being frivolous when I say that. There's certainly no standard of masculinity in this country which anybody can respect.
I can't tell you what I wish you would be doing. I can't redefine masculinity. I can't redefine black masculinity, certainly. I can only say what sticks in my craw. And I will not accept it. Because if I have to accept that, then I have to accept that you are my enemy.
Really? Why do you say that? I don't feel that.
You're in the business of redefining black masculinity, and I'm saying, hey, please go on doing that, because I don't know how much longer I can hold this fort. And I really feel that black women are holding it, and we're beginning to hold it in ways that are making this dialogue less possible.
Huh. It seems to me you're blaming the black man for the trap he's in.
I'm not blaming the black man. I'm saying don't shed my blood. I'm not blaming the black man. I'm saying my blood is being shed, and at some point, I'm going to have a legitimate reason to take up a knife and cut your fucking throat.
Ah.
And I'm not trying to do that.
If you drive a man mad, you'll turn him into a beast. It's got nothing to do with color.
If you drive a woman insane, she will react like a beast too. There is a larger structure, which is a society where we are in total and absolute war. We live in the mouth of a dragon, and we must be able to see each other's forces to fight it together, because we need each other. I am saying that if our joint battle, we have also developed some real, very real weapons, and when we use them against each other, they are even more bloody, because we know each other in a particular way. We are both black. It is even worse because we are doing this in a structure when we are already embattled. I'm not denying it. It is a family discussion we're having now. I'm not laying blame.
Okay. No. No. I'm not being abstract. I'm saying the image of masculinity by which the country is controlled, the image of power by which the country is controlled. It's not black. And there's on a level that you could say, on which you could say, we don't.
You're still talking about blame, and I'm not. Look, I do not blame black men for what and for where they are. I'm asking them to move beyond. I do not blame black men. What I'm saying is we have to take a new look at the ways in which we fight our joint oppression, because if we don't, we're going to be blowing each other up. We have to begin to redefine the terms of what woman is, what man is, and how we relate to each other. Women are the victims of rape and battery. Women are the victims of rape and battery.
Men, when they go to prison, are raped too.
Men are raped too. That's right, Jimmy. That's right.
And in the streets. I was raped in the streets.
What?
I know what I'm talking about.
But the line has been drawn.
Not by a black man.
All right. Then how do we begin? We have to accept equal responsibility for examining the process of disintegrating that line.
Fine. Oh, they wanted it on the floor.
Do we just go?
Wow.
You know what? Unfair. Let's have an, wow, thank you so much. Literally upstaged. Literally upstaged. That was really fantastic.
Yeah.
Can I just tell you why I'm upset? Okay. The reason that I'm upset is because while the two of you were performing that extremely interesting, just amazing moment, unbelievably well delivered and so important, I was just livid the whole time. One, I don't like to be upstaged, but two, I realized that one of the things, especially while the two of you were talking, that one of the things that I'm very cognizant of is that in sort of current queer studies and gender studies, Audre Lorde has largely been canceled as being a sort of turf feminist and is regularly being cut out of curricula. The idea being that there's a sort of, the way that gender studies works in American universities is a focus on things queer. And part of what that means is a specific type of politics that often forgets literally 100 years worth of Black thought around gender and sexuality that, by the way, Audre Lorde and James Baldwin are speaking to you. And so when we look at the sort of roots of what we now think of as a dominant theoretical tradition, the roots are never Black, they're never brown. It's always, a bunch of white folks founded this thing and then Black and brown people caught up. So you guys may be mad because my sense is that I wonder where that dialogue actually is in terms of the genealogies of how we need to be doing all of us need to be doing the work that we do, including folks who are of color and who are otherwise. So that's it. I'm over being mad about it now.
Just thank you both. I think that the way that you two were present with each other, it's just continuing to model what I hope can happen here, what I hope can happen for the rest of the day.
Yeah. Can I talk about more stuff that I'm mad about?
I mean,
for one thing, I'm mad that
antagonisms.
I'm very excited about what you're doing and the fact that you have this new book coming out. I just want to ask you, I wanted to ask you for a while. You're this left, progressive, super advanced person. So why involve yourself in this unbelievably conservative form? Like, why would you do this? Why would you do a biography? Biographies are just as conservative as they get. And both of us have training specifically as literary and cultural critics, and the biographical is exactly what you're supposed to be ashamed of if you're actually good at what we do. So why turn to that?
What a great question. So I'll say, hey, I'm Alexis. Really excited to be here. And I avoided the form of the biography for literally as long as I possibly could. And then it was my partner's 40th birthday. Jean Godard shares a birthday with Alexis DeVoe, first biographer of Audre Lorde. And we all celebrated together with this revival in Durham. And Sharon Bridgeforth interviewed Alexis DeVoe in the kitchen about how she came to write Warrior Poet, the first ever biography of Audre Lorde. The story is incredible, but it's her story to tell, or you could listen to Sharon's podcast or whatever you want to do. But one thing that Alexis said was, so this is 20 years ago, she published this biography. She said, and I don't understand why in all this time, no one else has written another biography of Audre Lorde. And everyone in the room turned to me, and I tried to hide behind like a cup or something, whatever I was holding. I was like, And then the next day, when everybody was returning to where they lived, revival's over, I got the phone call from a person who's now my literary agent, who says, I've been asking everybody about a biography of Audre Lorde. Where's the next biography of Audre Lorde? And the people keep telling me to contact you. And I was like, you know, Tavia reminds us the roots of the term conspiracy. Breathing together, I was like, what in the world? So at a certain point, it would be disrespectful to then ignore or refuse this part of my assignment. So then the question became, how do I want to relate to this task of life writing? And I looked to my teachers. I looked to Farah Jasmine Griffin's non-biography of Billie Holiday. I looked to Robin Kelly's biography of Thelonious Monk. It starts with that scene where he's having a dream that he's playing the piano and Monk comes and says, you're making all the wrong mistakes. I looked at Maurice Conde's speculative, imagined biography of a grandmother she didn't know very much about. I started to think about exactly how queer my relationship needed to be to this form. And I don't know, you all will be the judge of what I came up with, but hey, Donna, just someone who I've known since they were a tiny child. Sometimes I think of it as 58 different biographies, different ways of telling life story of Audre Lorde. There is a chapter that's actually in science fiction mode. There's a way that I still refuse to take on the form of the biography.
I was going to say, do you trust the form at the end of it?
No.
I totally don't. Oh my God, no. It's a very complicated, clunky thing that you should not let kids put their hands into. Because once you get stuck into it, it becomes this multivalence thing that it becomes nearly impossible to get out of. And there's so much sort of baggage around biographing and what people think that actually is, and having it be sort of hagiography that you can't do if you're actually going to be a good biographer.
Possession. I mean, so Valerie Boyd, the great writer Valerie J. Boyd, I had the gift of, right after she wrote her biography of Zora Neale Hurston, Wrapped in Rainbows, she came to Barnard, where I was an undergraduate student, and she gave the first talk that she gave about that biography. And is my Barnard sister here? And it was at the a symposium honoring 75 years since Zora Neale Hurston at Barnard. And her printer didn't work. And she lost the talk that she wanted to give and wasn't able to give it because of this printer malfunction. And she ended up getting up there and talking about the process of writing this biography in a way I had never heard somebody talk about possession, or just really like let go of the pretense of objectivity in such a profound way. And I don't think that's even what she had intended to do, but then the printer didn't work. And so Valerie was the person also who I reached out to when I was having to deal with how would I propose to write a biography. And this is, what I wrote is very different than Wrapped in Rainbows. But that still gave me permission to let go of a lot of things that I associated with biographies that made me not want to write them. For example, the pretense of not only objectivity, but of expertise, of like closing down an interpretation of what does this person's life mean? What did this moment in this person's life mean? The function of Audre Lorde in my life, in my teaching, in my facilitating, is to continually open up more wonder, more curiosity, a lot of doubt, and to continue the deflection that she actually does, which is to say, my work is not about you understanding me. My work should hopefully activate something in you that can't be contained, right? The liberatory aspect of it is not to include myself in a narrative, but the liberatory aspect of it is to free you from the narratives that you may not even know you've taken on for yourself that are entrapping you, which we see happening in even this excerpt of an excerpt of days of conversation that Audre Lorde and James Baldwin were in at Hampshire.
Can I say something a little bit tangential to that? And that is, I've now been working on this for close to a decade. And people always ask me exactly the same three questions. One, I'm a Southern person, I'm from North Carolina, and I was raised a Pentecostal. And they're like, oh, James Baldwin was black and raised a Pentecostal and gay, and you too, fella. And I always think, billions on multiple continents. I gave a funny voice, but they all say the same thing. And I always think, golly, these are people who don't, one, think that, there's a gay thing, but two, also who think really there's a Pentecostal thing. So I really was raised a Pentecostal, and James Baldwin was raised a Pentecostal in that tradition. But Pentecostalism exists within history and changed over that 50-year period. So that James Baldwin was being raised in storefront churches. Pentecostalism by the time I was going into huge cathedrals as a 14-year-old was a mega business with massive churches that took over the government ultimately, and a movement that took over much of our culture. And so the attitude of the relationship to the object to the person you're biographing has to be one-to-one with you is something that's super, 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 super clumsy. And two, I think that the sort of ways in which people deal with James Baldwin's sexuality, people ask me, literally once a week, somebody asks me if I have secret information about James Baldwin's romantic and sexual life. And I always say the clumsy thing, I don't even have secret information about my own romantic and sexual life. It's never funny. It never works out. But I always think it's going to be clever this time. And the point being, I think people don't actually want actual information. What they want is, can you give us the secret boyfriend that James Baldwin had, or the secret woman that James Baldwin had, versus the clear evidence, which is that there's a complicated romantic and sexual life for this human being that actually will not fit nicely into a developmental biography. That's true with the subject completely. So you get to this person that you like very much once you spend time with his materials. And this person is sort of an asshole too, and who you get to see, oh golly, there's no way this individual could have made it this far without having more than sharp edges and with some alacrity. He was very good at getting his bills paid. Still good at paying them on the other end. But the idea that somehow you have to have this sort of emotional connection or this one-to-one connection with your subject, I think can mess with your ability to actually see the subject. I really do. So it's funny, at the end of many years of doing this, I don't know who Jimmy is. I never call James Baldwin Jimmy. For one thing, James Baldwin would be 100 years old. I'm 59. I would at least throw Mr. Jimmy in front of it. You know what I mean? I would never call a person that age by diminutive. But two, I think that people do it too much because they imagine that they have already sort of figured out little Jimmy Baldwin. Actually, if you saw that play, the gay little Jimmy Baldwin shows up. It won one of those play things. But little Jimmy Baldwin showed up twice on Broadway last year. Little Jimmy Baldwin as a character showed up twice. One time just dancing, with the idea being that what people are really looking for is the truth behind that fella. And I think, gosh, how could that made up thing be functional? Especially when you have this person with so much paper that tells you what he's actually thinking at the moment. And the paper, I think, tends to be stuff that folks are not so interested in. I think a lot of the sort of everyday truth people are not that sort of interested in, you know.
Yeah, so I wanted to give, speaking of actual information, I wanted to give some context for the conversation, and Claudia, you gave amazing context about that historical moment. I wanted to think about, or maybe even help us think about and be able to be with some of the different places that Audre Lorde and James Baldwin are coming from in that whole conversation,
Right.
and in their lives. And two that I really think are important are their relationship to the frame of the nation, idea of an American dream, which James Baldwin kind of considers to be their shared common ground, and Audre Lorde does not consider to be their shared common ground. And then also, gender and sexuality and how they hold it in the conversation, and also in their public lives, which are very different.
Right.
Their roles being very different, especially in that Baldwin playing the role of like a racial spokesperson is different. Audre Lorde is never a racial spokesperson. I don't think she's necessarily trying to be a racial spokesperson, but there's a very different relationship that we have there. So maybe we can talk about those two things, starting with the nation. For Audre Lorde, I would say some of the important context. So Claudia mentioned the invasion of Grenada, which was very important for Audre Lorde's entire sense of everything that happened afterwards, but also what happened before. And so it may not be the case that Audre Lorde always thought of herself as primarily of the Caribbean, or really experientially that she always felt this thing that her mother said, which is like, this isn't really home, right? Like, we're here in the United States, but home is somewhere else. But certainly, and this is the time period where she's putting that out front, and she's articulating that over and over again, in but not of the United States. And at the same time, in her work around thinking about the US invasion of Grenada, also in her work in solidarity with South Africa, she is thinking about privilege and her proximity to empire as somebody who has citizenship in the United States, as something that is strategically important in her solidarity with people of color around the world, very explicitly. So her essay, Grenada, an Interim Report, is really important for that. But she's also not saying that she can then just map onto like being Grenadian, because she doesn't want to colonize in that way, right? And so she's saying, I have to be honest about what my citizenship privileges are, even if I'm second, third, fourth class citizen in the United States, and operationalize that in service of my broader vision of what it means to be a participant in Earth, like Earth as a process. So I think that is different from James Baldwin. I mean, in his larger work, but in the conversation, goes back to this idea of a North American wilderness, the psychology of the American dream, but also what it means to be in the context of the United States, which is interesting because, as we know, and as we were talking about earlier, he's not living in the United States, like mostly he's not living in the United States. And Audre Lorde never actually lives outside of the United States. Even in St. Croix, she's in the US Virgin Islands, but their relationships to nation are so very, very different. So I was wondering if you have something to say about James Baldwin's relationship to nation and the idea of America. Let's go.
I think a lot of it is made up. For one thing, I think that whole oh my God, James, here's the big lie. In 1957, Jimmy came back home. What a bunch of bullshit. It is just a bunch of bullshit. The truth of the matter is that James Baldwin leaves in 1948, goes to Paris, and in fact does come back to the United States in 1957 and ends up taking an apartment and ends up eventually buying a house in the 70s, I think on 71st Street. But in terms of everyday residents, that in fact the most common place for James Baldwin was in fact continued to be in Paris. Also, we know about his very close relationship with people in Istanbul. And he continued to be a person who was a sort of citizen of the world. Look, at James Baldwin's death, right before James Baldwin's death, he's made a commander of the Legion of Honor in France. He's very much associated with French culture during the course of his lifetime, and he's very much associated with a sort of international elite. I think that good writers are tricky. And so that one of the things that you see about James Baldwin, he's doing all of this work around sort of demonstrating the movement to the world. And we pay a lot of attention to his traveling to the South in order to go and report on particularly what's happening with young people. And obviously he's going to be on the cover of Time magazine, I believe in 1963, as the sort of face of the Birmingham movement. James Baldwin was not intimately involved in the Birmingham movement in that way. The reason his cover is on the face of Time is because he's become a symbol for articulate blackness in the country. And part of the reason I think that he becomes I know that he becomes a symbol for a certain type of articulate blackness in the country is that he is very systematically published in all of the major journals in this country. Studies that always begin with sort of going in and looking at this noble black person who is doing good in a town and sort of treats that individual like a sculpture. And then you look at the sort of nobility of that person, and then it sort of bleeds out into the larger movement and explaining what happens. That becomes a super, super, super palatable method. I mean, it's super beautiful. We've all read it, and it's so compelling. But it's not the same. We imagine that it's insider. It's not. It's often about going and looking at, oh my gosh, the sort of beauty of this movement or the beauty of this individual and translating it to a largely elite audience in a way that I think we interpret as intimacy, or as a way that is sort of that intimacy becomes a thing that's sort of clearly manufactured by any number of writers. I'll say it also, by the way, just in relation to James Baldwin's stuff around being a sort of central figure to the development of an LGBTQ movement and sense of culture in the 50s and 60s on this country. Now, James Baldwin writes very, very beautifully about same-sex desire, but also there's a lot of homophobic and transphobic stuff all through Baldwin's stuff. The first image I ever read in my life of a trans person was in Giovanni's room. And I just read this thing last week and I was like, you know, James Baldwin could have gotten beaten up for writing that about me. You know what I'm saying? It's a very, very nasty response to this individual. The person is only ever referred to as it. The person is described as smelling. The person is described as dressed in tacky way. She does say, you know, you will end in, I think it's Tourant, in chagrin, you're going to end in pain. To David, the character, that actually is true. But there's a lot of sort of weirdly transphobic and homophobic stuff in Baldwin that we then interpret, I think, as being, oh, look at these positive images that have actually happened. We think of Giovanni's room as this movement forward in LGBTQ literature. Giovanni gets the guillotine in the end. You know, this is a very, very ugly story that I'm not sure is about Baldwin's actually sort of demonstrating, okay, this new movement. I think he's taking the first ugly steps towards doing that, but I think that the ways in which we now interpret him sort of rob him of his ability, his growth as a scholar over time. So by the time you get to late Baldwin, he's talking about gender fluidity and maleness and femaleness in every human being. You forget that took a long damn time for brother to get to that, and that there's lots of evidence along the way of his struggling with that stuff in a way that I think, we imagine a certain type of magic and not work that happens with individuals. versus this sort of spark that you're just sort of born with. I think it's really delimiting when you talk about James Baldwin.
Right, and all the conversations, right, and all the challenging conversations and the debates and the pushing. So,
can I say one other thing about that, just as a tacky aside? Also, James Baldwin's junior high school French teacher was County Cullen. Love it. You know, County Cullen taught at James Baldwin's high school, and also encouraged James Baldwin to go to DeWitt Clinton High School, where County Cullen had also gone. But by the time County Cullen is teaching French in the junior high school system, people are talking about his failed marriage with Yolanda Du Bois, I could be making these facts up. I'm hoping that someone will help me with this. I think it's Yolanda Du Bois, and also his relationship with. I'll remember it in a second. With Hugh Jackman, not Hugh Jackman, no. Not Hugh Jackman. Hugh
Jackman from X-Men, but different.
Hugh Jackman and James Baldwin were lovers. There you go. No, sorry, I'm kidding. It's not true.
It's okay. Collectively, we'll find it. We'll eventually find it.
Hugh, we'll remember in a second, of this affair that the two of them presumably had. By the time County Cullen is teaching in that junior high school, County Cullen is a known sort of Harlem queer. Do you know? So part of what's going on there is a certain type of, a certain type of pedagogy. I'm sure that County Cullen doesn't say I'm a gay man to 14-year-old James Baldwin, but I know that County Cullen has a huge amount of influence in James Baldwin's life, and County Cullen had been friends with Buford Delaney. Buford Delaney was James Baldwin's mentor, the person who first produced the first professional image of James Baldwin, while the two of them lived in Boston. So that there's a certain type of what we would now think of as queer nurturance that goes on with James Baldwin, but that was also often phobic and based in certain types of real ugliness that was happening around gay male sexuality in Harlem and lesbian sexuality in Harlem at the time, especially in elite Harlem.
Yeah, so I think that maybe we could talk about what?
Harold
Jackman.
You said Hugh Jackman. You're the one who started it off.
Okay, so if we can think about the intergenerational stakes, right? So you're talking about from County Cullen to James Baldwin. In the conversation, there is this talk of the children, right? The talk of what needs to happen in the future. And Audre Lorde ends up saying, like, what can you do for my son? How can you model a different masculinity? And it's interesting because Joseph Beam then reads that excerpt in Essence and like raises his hand, and he in the radio profile on Audre Lorde that Jennifer Abbott produced talks about like this exact thing. He's like, I read that conversation and she's asking for a certain thing from James Baldwin, and I don't know, but I feel that it's crucial and part of my role in Black community to model a different masculinity that is more loving. Of course, we know Joseph Beam for saying Black men loving Black men is a revolutionary act of the 80s, and theorizing that in the life, in his essay Brother to Brother, as something that also will address and impact the repression and the violence that Audre Lorde is talking about in this conversation, that impact everyone, but especially impact Black women in the process. And so for me, it's interesting because reading this conversation as part of, it comes with, Audre Lorde in 1979 in her keynote for the Third World Conference of Lesbians and Gays, is talking about the children, our children, right? And she very explicitly is like, the children that we actually are raising and have given birth to, but she says all children are the responsibility of those of us gathered here, lesbian and gays of color self-identified, right? So it's not a return to an idea of a patriarchal intergenerationality. It's saying our intergenerational responsibility, she continues this in Turning the Beat Around, lesbian parenting, and all of this means that we have to talk about this explicitly. But then we see also James Baldwin in, you talked about it as like when we were talking earlier, as this like pretending to be the Black patriarch. Right. And we see it also in the much shared video of James Baldwin talking with Nikki Giovanni about this kind of like weird thing where it's like we know that James Baldwin is not necessarily in this role, but also is it doing work to protect him in terms of what he doesn't want to say about his sexuality? And so because you are doing this work about the making of an icon and what it means for James Baldwin to be functioning in the way that he's functioning, which I think is an important distinguish from like, also how did he always feel? Who was he at the time? But how he's functioning as an icon. I just wonder if, there's something else there. I wonder if you could say more about that, but I feel like there was something else I want to say first, which is slipping away. But maybe it's this piece around Ada Gay Griffin, who is at this conversation at Hampshire and is watching this conversation. She's a student of Gloria Joseph, who's the person who invited them to have this conversation at Hampshire. Gloria Joseph being in an emergent relationship with Audre Lorde, and Gloria Joseph and Audre Lorde actually went to Grenada together, the visit to Grenada where Audre Lorde wrote that interim report I was talking about before. Ada Gay Griffin was a student in this class called The Insurgent Sister, which I'm like, to have been in that class, right. Seems like an amazing class. And they all were at this event, and Ada Gay Griffin talks about the fact that the reason that she went on to collaborate with Michelle Parkerson to make the film A Litany for Survival about Audre Lorde, the reason that she was like, whatever we do, we have to document on film this person, Audre Lorde, was because she was seeing the difference between what Audre Lorde would claim and what James Baldwin would claim in that room where they, as students, speaking of another generation, were watching and learning something. And Ada talks about sitting there and saying she realized that, for Ada, she was like, yeah, there have been lesbian and gay Black writers always, county colored, this is not something that's new. But for her, Audre Lorde was the first person who was saying, one, I'm out, this is who I am, but also that my sexuality needs to be recognized as much as my Blackness in the way that I'm here politically and in the standpoint that I'm offering in this conversation and every other conversation. And so the function of Audre Lorde in that way is very different than the function of James Baldwin in that way. And I wonder what you think about, is it the trap of being like a spokesperson for all Black people and therefore not being able to parse out and sit there and say, Black lesbian poet, warrior mother, the way that Audre Lorde did when she came into space. And honestly, the way that she did because she specifically felt harmed by Langston Hughes not saying the litany of who he was when she was growing up in Harlem, inside of his sphere, participating in the Harlem Writers Guild, and she felt that she personally suffered for what he did not name intergenerationally in front of her. So, do you have thoughts about that in relationship to James Baldwin in our last 5 minutes?
Right. Well, I can answer your one question. Yes, Black patriarchy is a trap. It's a trap. You're gonna look ugly, you're gonna lose money, don't do it. Just skip that, No. If you wanna live long, be pretty the whole way, get feminist. You really just gotta do it.
ASAP.
I don't have good responses to you, but I have juicy details to offer you. And that is that you're talking about, you mentioned the first ever Black anthology in this country is a thing called In the Life. It was published, edited by a man named Joseph Beam. Joseph Beam wrote to James Baldwin and asked him to contribute to In the Life. It's at the Schomburg. James Baldwin did not respond to that, but he did keep the card, which that's a tick for me. And then the second thing is, I think that we forget that a lot of the sort of narrative of LGBTQ this and that that we use now is positive. The narratives that he had for him were in fact narratives that were specifically about horror and communities of people who were thought to be awful. So one of the things that he says very clearly is that he bases Giovanni's Room, or gets the idea for it, and also Another Country from the story of, I think, Lucien Carr, if you all know that, if you are New Yorkers who know that story. So Lucien Carr was one of the first ever persons to have a successful, this is one of the first successful gay panic cases. I believe Lucien Carr was a beat who stabbed a person to death in Central Park who made a pass at him and then got off. And so Baldwin talks about the fact that that's the place at which Giovanni's Room and Another Country begins, because he's interested in that sort of passion. But he's not necessarily interested in the articulation of something like a positive LGBTQ thing. And I don't know that he was particularly interested in a black version of that. I can say that if you go and look at his correspondence, which he did keep, there is a massive amount of particularly young men who write to him from all over the world, loads and loads and loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of letters, so he's aware of what actually happens. We have 5 minutes. But the truth of the matter, I don't know that he actually ever responded to those folks, and I certainly don't have a sense that he responded to a black person of the several black persons that I know who wrote. I have no more respect for any writer on the planet than James Arthur Baldwin. I think, however, in order for us to do right by him and to do right by his legacy, we have to get past the idea that what we're looking at is a person whom we want to revere separate from their work. I say, get over the damn Jimmy complex. Jimmy's not going to be your friend. You're not going to be able to drink with him. You don't have to be a person who you can take home to mama in order to be a genius. I've proven that myself, and both ways of that. And the truth of the matter is, I think that we do ourselves a disservice by wanting to have this sort of saint versus actually having one of the great minds of the 20th century as part of our legacy. I'll leave it alone.
Okay. In just our last 2 minutes before we open it up for Q&A, could you say a little bit about, because you told us a little bit about some of what James Baldwin was going through when he was at the 5 colleges?
Okay.
Which is
Ready.
The context of this conversation?
The James Baldwin and the last years of his life was what's called a 5-college professor. The 5 colleges are the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and then the 4 liberal arts colleges that are in that area. And he was teaching around mainly at the University of Massachusetts. He was having a lot of trouble with his classes, students openly rebelling and saying that they weren't well prepared. But also, weirdly enough, there were charges of James Baldwin as an anti-Semite. You all may know who Julius Lester was. Julius Lester is a black and Jewish man who led that charge against James Baldwin. I'm not going to say more about it because I don't know all the details of it in my hand right now, but it was interestingly enough about Israel and Palestine and public positions that he had taken at that time. So those teaching years, by the way, as everybody in this room who is a teacher knows, some days the teaching's great, and then there's Tuesday, and so, I think that James Baldwin was an excellent teacher on some days and a less than excellent teacher on others.
Do you all have any questions?
There's really Q&A? They didn't tell us there was Q&A. Oh my God.
There are mics for people with questions. Here we go.
I think you should wait for the mic.
So yeah, we can all hear you for the recording too.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much. That was very illuminating. I learned a great deal. And the excerpt, the acting out of it was just marvelous. Congratulations. I felt listening to it again, I've read it several times, there's a lot of tangled stuff in there. And I just want you to touch the tangles a bit. So there is this idea of family floating around. In fact, it's even said. Now, what Audre Lorde perceives as family responsibility, so different, I think, from what Baldwin might have said, given his experiences as a child, etc., etc. So the family thing, so they're speaking at cross purposes. I'm not saying they don't understand it, but they're speaking across a threshold, I think, and the threshold is not the same. And then this question of violence against women and her kind of pointing a finger in some ways to black male, if I understand it right, black male neglect in the anti-racist struggle, neglect about what is happening in the ghetto, which he says is more or less, Gaza. I mean, it's not exactly, but he says it from what in that context, that there is another dynamic of violence against women, rape, that somehow this enclosed world and the male anti-racist, anti-colonialist spokespeople don't pick up. That's this other tangle about expectation, responsibility, and choice. My third question really is that one of the things that I find so compelling about Baldwin is, in that dialogue when he says, well, people want to be safe, they want to feel safe. And it's, of course, resonates now because you have a surveillance state and the people who are most at risk are those people who Baldwin was talking about or Audre Lorde was talking about. Except now you also have migrants, you have refugees, you LGBTQ communities. So I think he was very interested in this notion of risk as a way of expressing agency. So he was ambivalent, you'd know much better, that, you can't say no to risk. In fact, he says, those of us who have very little must take the largest risk. I think it's in the Fire Next Time. So these are three issues: family, home, black masculinity, and anti-racism versus, what's happening to women, and this question of risk and security. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So listening to this after you, I was like, uh-oh, we really out of time. They turned my mic out. After learning from you that James Baldwin is talking about Israel and Palestine in his classroom and facing these charges of anti-Semitism had me hear it very differently when we rehear all that's missing is the barbed wire in the ghetto. When he says occupied territory, right? He uses that language, and I didn't know that he was at that time as a professor in that space.
By the way, Julius Lester writes a pamphlet about this.
Yeah. I'm like, my dream is that you had reviewed the pamphlet in preparation for this conversation because it's so profoundly relevant to this moment, but I can send it. But I'll say the pamphlet that I know about. So in terms of the piece around violence, and this is context that I wanted to give, so I'm so glad you asked about this, is that Audre Lorde is also, she has written Need, a Chorale for Black Women's Voices, not long before this conversation. And this is her response to, in 1979, in the first 3 months of that year, the murder of 12 black women. And Barbara Smith is sending her clippings every time somebody is killed. And then she's getting the clippings from Detroit. And then she's getting of all of these black women who are being murdered by black men in their own communities. And she writes this chorale. It's part of an effort that the Combahee River Collective is doing, and all of this. So it's in performance, and then she's having conversations, and so there's an addition of need that has one of these conversations with younger Black men who can't hear it and who are defensive and triggered by this specific look at what the impact is on Black women who are being murdered. So, and in the piece, she's speaking in the voice of some of these women, if they could speak now, which of course they can't because they've been murdered. So that's very present. And so when she's bringing up this issue of violence, she's not just thinking about the fact that she's traumatized by this violence in this moment, but also that how have these young men who have read James Baldwin not able to be in a conversation with her about this, right? So she's pointing a finger not like James Baldwin's the one, but that what did he not do such that there's a conversation that's foreclosed, speaking of which that says wrap it up.
What?
But you should say something because I spoke first.
This is really great. I was going to say something about sexual violence, and I didn't necessarily want to end on that. I would just want to point out that James Baldwin says in that thing that he's been raped. And certainly we know that James Baldwin was also molested as about a 12-year-old. And certainly we know that James Baldwin was beaten up a fair amount, and also had bunches of dicey situations. So I don't know how to tie that into what we're talking about here, but there's a way in which I'm not sure that the moment that he is having that conversation with Audre Lorde, that the same vocabulary around men's sexuality and men's predation on men is something that was something that could have been as easily said. But I know that it's part of the way that he has put together.
For sure, for sure. Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you.